and welcome back to Easy as IEP. This is session 7. We're talking all about accommodations. My name is Catalina Uribe, and I'm a clinical support administrator for the UM-NSU Center for Autism. Accommodations. So the purpose of special education is to prepare students with disabilities for further education, employment, and independent living. If your child is not taught how to read, write, spell, and do basic arithmetic, then they might not be fully prepared for adult roles or for their life after school. Accommodations and modifications are meant to help provide the materials and environments necessary for your child to learn these skills. It's important to know that accommodations and modifications are different. Accommodations don't change what your child is learning, but rather how they are learning. Modifications, on the other hand, do change what they are learning to some degree. So, for example, a modification may include a shorter test or half the amount of homework as a general education student might receive. An accommodation would be a different format of the test. So having someone read out the test out loud, which may accommodate for some reading issues that the child may have, but the test remains the same one that the general education peers are receiving. Any student with a disability who has been evaluated and determined to have a disability under IDEA or Section 504, which is a 504 plan, may have accommodations. The student's needs for accommodations are documented in either the IEP or the 504 plan, whichever one they require. According to the Department of Education, in accordance with IDEA, students with disabilities may need accommodations to make progress in the general curriculum and to function in daily life. However, selecting the same accommodations for all students with a particular disability is not appropriate. Similarly, accommodations that are unnecessary can have a negative impact on a student's performance. The accommodations, much like everything else in the IEP, should be based on the learning and behavior characteristics of the student's needs that result from the disability. It should be very individualized, in other words. Here are some things to consider. So in addition to considering the type of accommodation that would best support the student given the barrier presented by his or her disability, the IEP team might also consider and discuss the following to help identify a potentially effective accommodation. First, the present levels of achievement and academic performance, the individual strengths and needs, the specific learning goals, academic or social behaviors that might interfere with the student's learning, modalities that work best for the student. So for example, are they visual learners? Are they auditory learners? Accommodations that have already been tried, it's important to know what has been successful and what hasn't been successful. Sometimes you'll find that accommodations may be successful in one class or one setting, one subject, but not in another. So it's important to note those differences. You'll also want to consider some of the challenges presented by the use of the accommodations. So for example, if a child has communication difficulties and they use a voice output device, one of the challenges might be that it's kind of hard to play on the playground and use their device at the same time. You'll want to consider how the accommodation will be evaluated to determine whether or not it's working. And finally, whether the student is amenable to the accommodation and are they likely to use it. The accommodation is only as good at if the user is going to actually use it. So that's a big one to consider. So when you're selecting options, you can use this visual to help you run down and choose the appropriate accommodation. So for example, you'll start with this question. Can your child participate in the activity in the same way as her peers? If yes, then there's no problem, no need for an accommodation. If not, can she do the same activity with adapted materials? If yes, you get the adapted materials. If not, can she do the same activity with adapted expectations and materials? If not, can she accomplish the goals of the lesson by working with a partner or small group? So remember, sometimes the point of the lesson is beyond the tangible product that is produced. So maybe the goal of a writing assignment is not actually writing a paragraph, but it's being able to compare and contrast. So maybe the child has a hard time writing, but they can communicate verbally, and they'll use partners or small groups in order to talk about those comparing and contrasting skills. If not, can she do the same activity with intermittent assistance from an adult? If not, can she do the same activity with direct adult assistance? If not, can she do a different parallel activity? So this really helps you find what level of support the child needs, and in turn, what accommodation might be necessary. Some final considerations. After the planning team has considered a number of possible accommodations, they can help the student select a more specific accommodation. The team can use the following criteria and questions to consider the potential impact of the accommodation that they're planning on choosing. So first, is it necessary? Does the student require the accommodation to perform the task? Will it reduce or eliminate the impact of the student's disability? And or will it increase the student's ability to access information and demonstrate performance? Does it support independence? So can the student perform the task more independently with an accommodation? This would require an accommodation to be easy to use, so we often opt for the least complex alternative. And does it support continued skill development and promote self-sufficiency? Is it generalizable? Can the student use the accommodation for similar tasks? Can you use it for other tasks completely? Can you use it in different settings? Finally, is it acceptable? So does the child feel the accommodation will be helpful? First, are they willing to use it? And second, do they also prefer this accommodation over others that are equally effective? So in terms of the actual accommodations, we see it presented in 4 basic categories. We have presentation, which is a change in the way information is presented. Response, a change in which a child completes assignments or tests. Setting, a change in the environment where a child learns. And then timing and scheduling, which is a change to the time a child has for a task or the schedule in which they complete it. So this is an example. Again, I believe this is from understood.org, which is if you've been around for this IEP session, it's a website that I really recommend to parents and caregivers. So when we're thinking of what kind of accommodation a child needs, whether it's presentation, response, setting, or timing and scheduling, we'll first look at the barriers and then we'll look at examples. So if the barrier is related to the way information is presented, so whether it's text, lecture, or video, then we'll pursue a presentation accommodation. So this allows a student to access information in ways other than the standard visual or auditory means. It might change the way that instruction, directions, and information are presented. Some examples might be books and materials with large print, visual cues, for example, color-coded text, audiobooks, and closed captions on videos. If the barrier is the way in which the student is required to respond, for example, the writing example that I provided or verbal words, then you'll need a response accommodation. So this allows students to complete assignments or assessments through ways other than the typical verbal and written responses. Some examples are using speech-to-text software. So if they have to write a paper, instead they'll just speak to their computer and the computer will type it for them. Or they can orally dictate responses during a test. If the barrier is related to the characteristic of the setting, for example, the noise level or the lighting, then you'll need a setting accommodation, which allows for a change in the environment or how the environment is structured. This might include preferential seating, so maybe sitting near the teacher, maybe sitting towards the front of the room so that you're not distracted by people in front of you. Or maybe for assessments, this requires you to test in a separate location. Finally, if the barrier is related to the timing and schedule of instruction, so the time of the day or the length of the assignment, then you'll want a timing and scheduling accommodation. This allows for changes to when and how long students have to complete assignments or assessments, and allows assignments to be broken down into smaller sections. Some examples include extended time to complete a task, frequent breaks during the task, and shorter testing sessions. So to give you a little bit more visual prompts for each of the accommodations, I should say, here are some for presentation. Again, we can break this down even further into visual presentation, tactile presentation, and auditory presentation. So for the visual, we see large print to facilitate the ease of reading and make text clear. Contrast, which is again to make materials easier to see for the student. Video recordings with closed captioning to help students better follow along with the lesson. The beauty, of course, of having video recorded lessons is that the child can stop, can go back if they miss something, and then continue on in their learning. In terms of tactile, this might be for children who also have visual impairments, so maybe they need braille, tactile images, or haptics and haptic feedback in order to get the learning that they need. Finally, in terms of auditory, you can have a scribe to read text to the child. So when you're taking a test, the teacher can read the questions out loud. The screen readers, which use text-to-speech software to convert digital text into voice output. And then, of course, recorded books or texts. In terms of response accommodations, we can have that same scribe who takes notes for the child. So rather than the child doing the writing, the scribe does it. Or maybe during a test, instead of the child completing the paperwork, the scribe completes it at the direction of the child. You might also see a word processor or computers, which are helpful, again, for children who have trouble with handwriting. This way, they can use a computer to type out their answers. We have AAC, which is augmentative and alternative communication. This not only includes the fancy voice output device, but also sentence strips, which are visuals, and even sign language. Setting accommodations may refer to physical accessibility, such as preferential seating, as I mentioned, special lighting, or general physical access, especially if a child has mobility issues. Setting accommodations also refer to supports for behavior and attention in the form of classroom rule posters, right? So that's a verbal prompt that they can always look at. You might need noise buffers, so noise canceling headphones, and increased or decreased opportunities for movement. Lastly, setting accommodations include the organization of space and materials, such as using compartmentalized containers, diagrams, and checklists, or even limiting the amount of materials. So sometimes when a child is overwhelmed by the choices provided, if the teacher simply limits the amounts of choices, then the child is able to cope better and can then engage in the activity that is necessary. Finally, we see our time and schedule accommodations. Scheduling accommodations include, as I mentioned, the extended time on exams or extended time to complete tasks and homework, or designated time for a higher frequency of breaks. So maybe a child requires a break after every paragraph read or after 10 minutes of instruction. Schedule adjustments may need to be made due to students' performance. So for example, when I was a teacher, I used to have my playground scheduled right before my morning circle time, but there wasn't enough time to really prepare for that transition from coming into the classroom to going to playground. So what I had to do is, after a week or so of trying and being unsuccessful in getting into that routine, I was able to change the time that my circle time was held. That way, the students had a transition period. We were able to go to circle time and then go into the playground. So, of course, some schedules are more flexible than others because a school schedule does depend on all the other classrooms and all the other grades that are involved, but it's worth consideration. And finally, once you do have a good schedule implemented, then you'll want to create predictable routines and you'll want to provide a visual of that schedule. So these are great accommodations to implement either on a class-wide level or at an individual level for a child that might require it. This is our Padlet, and this is where I post all of the finished presentations for this series, as well as resources that I've found along the way. I hope, as always, that you learned a lot during this session, and I hope to see you during session number 8.